Hey, what's up? This is Jesse from Cantilever Games, and this is the Unity tutorial number 3 about prefabs and array lists. If you've been following along, so far we have this little gem here, and it moves up and down, and when you click on it, it'll disappear. I'll show you what that looks like. So this is kind of the beginning of a game that I want to walk through with you guys in several different tutorials. The next thing I really want to do with this is take this one gem and turn it into many gems, an array of gems. So we'll kind of have like a grid pattern of gems that come across and down and form a rectangle of gems that all move up and down, and you can click all of them and make them disappear. So to create this array of floating gems, one of the first things we want to do is take this gem and turn it into a prefab. By turning the gem into a prefab, we will now be able to copy the gem, and any changes we make to the gem prefab will be carried through to all the copies of the gem. This is very important because as we go along, as we build more levels, and as we have more gems of different types, the base stats of the gem we want to stay the same amongst all the gems. For example, the speed at which the gem moves up and down, that's something we might want to keep consistent across all of the gems. And this is what we could do with a prefab. To create a prefab from this gem, the first thing I'm going to do is put this gem inside of a parent object. This is usually good practice because you never know when you're going to need to have other things attached to the parent object, and it's just good to do it out right from the beginning. So to create a parent for the floating item, what I'm going to do is right click and create an empty inside of the floating item. The point of this is so that the game object will have its 0, 0, 0 coordinates the same as the floating item. So now you can pull the game object out of the floating item and make the floating item become a child of the game object. I'm now going to change the name of the game object to floating item parent. So now that we have a parent object with our floating item as a child, we can go ahead and create the prefab. Right now I haven't really organized this folder yet, so I think this is probably as good a time as any to do that. Typically you want to keep things organized, not all in one folder like this. So right now we're going to right click, create folder. The first one will be scripts, and I'll put the disappear script in there. The next folder I'll call materials. I'll put these two materials in there. I'll create another folder for animations. I'll put the animation and the controller in there. This next folder I'm going to call Blender. I'll put this in there. Okay, so finally I'm going to create one last folder called Prefabs. So within the Prefabs folder we will create our prefab for the floating item. To do this, you right click, go to create, and prefab. I'll call it floating item prefab. Now I'm going to take the floating item and drag it on top of the prefab. And that's pretty much it. So now if we come over to our floating item parent and click on it, there's now an area for prefab options. Select, revert, and apply. The one I use most is apply. Anytime I make a change to one of the prefabs that I want to be carried across all of the prefabs, you have to make sure to hit apply. So I'll show an example of how this works. Now we can just take this prefab object, drag it into the scene. I'll change its Z location to be 0. The same as the other object. And now when we hit play, we'll see that both objects move the same, and they both share the same property where if you click them they can disappear. Now I'll quickly show how prefabs work. So for example, with this item selected, I can change the scale in one direction, come over here, hit apply, and now this object is updated as well. And so now we can come back to the second object, change this to 1, hit apply, and the first object will update again, as well as the prefab down here. So we can add a third object, for example. Play. And again, these all work. You can click on them, delete them. And so that's going to be the first step of creating this array of floating objects, is to create the prefabs so that they all behave in the same way. So the second piece to creating this array of floating objects will be to actually create the parent object that's going to hold the array. And then within that parent object we want to create a script to create the array of objects and manage them. So to do that, first I'm going to come here and create an empty game object, and I'm going to call this array parent. So this game object will be the parent for all of the floating item prefabs that are going to be created within the array. They will appear as children of this parent object. So to do that, I'm going to come down to scripts and create a new C# script called create items. I'm going to attach this script to the array parent. Alright, so the first thing we're going to want in the script is a reference to the game object, the prefab that we created. So create a public game object and call it a floating item. So now that we have a reference to an object, our floating item prefab, we can now create it in the scene, and this is called instantiate. You can see here there's a few different ways to do it. The way that I see most, and the way that we're going to do it, is like this, where you put in the object that you want to create, its position, and quaternion rotation. If you come down here, you can see that this is kind of an example of how it's done, and I'm actually just going to copy this, paste it here. So we want to put floating item instead of prefab, new vector 3. For right now I'm just going to leave this at 0, 0, 0, and quaternion identity is what you typically see written here. So now we can save and take a quick look at what this does. Alright, so first thing I'm going to do is delete these floating items. We don't really need them anymore. If we click on the array parent, we can now see our script with the floating item game object. If we go to our prefab folder, we could drag the prefab onto this game object. And so now the script will use this prefab and instantiate it at 0, 0, 0. And you can see that's what happened. The object's been created, and it still animates, and you can click on it, and it still disappears. So now instead of just creating one object at the center of the screen, 0, 0, 0, we want to create an array of objects that are placed in a grid and spaced evenly in both the X and the Y direction. To do this, we're going to set up something called a nested for loop, which is basically a for loop within a for loop. If you're not familiar with for loops, this is actually a pretty good way to see visually what they're actually doing. So to create a basic for loop, you write for and then parentheses, and then we want to define an integer called I. So we write int I and set that equal to 0 initially. Within the for loop, you're going to use 3 semicolons. The first is this one. The next one is going to be, we're going to say I less than some value. And what this value is we'll create a public integer up here. And we'll call it numx. And I'll set that equal to 4 for right now. And basically what this is this is how many game objects we want in the X direction. At the same time, I'll get ready for the y direction and set up num y. And we'll also have 4 in the y direction. And so here we're going to say update I until you've reached the number 4. Then the last thing you write is I++. So each time it goes through the for loop, it's going to increase I by 1 until I is greater than or equal to num x, and then it will stop. So this is the first for loop, and we want to set up a second for loop within this to handle the y direction. This time we're going to say integer j, j less than num y, and j++. Now we can copy our instantiation and put this within the for loop. So what we want to do now is change where the object is created. Instead of being x equals 0, y equals 0, we want it to be x equals I, y equals j. But we don't just want I and j because these are just integers and the objects would be spaced very close to each other. So what we really want is I times space x and j times space y. Again, I'll create a public float so we can control these from the inspector. For right now, I'll just set these equal to 20. I don't know if that's actually a good value, but we could change it later. So if we hit save, we can take a look at what this does. It looks like it's exactly the same, but it's actually different. You can see here underneath array parent, but not children of the array parent, it has created 16 game objects, which is what we wanted. If we zoom out, you can see there they are. They're all moving up and down and all spinning. If I take the camera now and kind of place these in view, come back to the game preview, and you can see you can click and delete them as well. Alright, so I think I want to cut these values in half, maybe even less, maybe like 5. Yeah, I think that looks a lot better. They're spaced closer together. And so this is really what I wanted to create in this tutorial, is something like this. We'll just play it one more time and I'll show you that you can change these values here, say make them 6 and 6. Hit play again. You can see now there's an array of 6 by 6 instead of 4 by 4. So 2 more things I wanted to add in here. The first is that when we instantiate the game object, we don't want it to create it just anywhere in the hierarchy. We want to make it so that it creates it as a child of the game object that the script is attached to. In our example, that's this array parent. We want this floating item to be created as a child of the array parent. So to do this, the first thing I'm going to do is, instead of just instantiating this game object and forgetting about it, we're going to store it in a new game object variable. I'll call it my object. And so now we could say my object.transform.parent equals game object dot transform. Forgot the equal sign there. So now if we save and play, we can see now that the game object are created as children of the array parent. The final thing I want to do is take these objects and actually add them to a list so that we could do other things with them later. So to do that, we'll write public list, and you need to specify the type. We're going to be using game objects. Then you give it a name. I'm going to call this floating items. I'm going to set that equal to a new list of type game objects. And then here you want to do parentheses. So now that we have the list, we can add our game objects to it as we create them. So we could say floating items dot add my object. And so now every time a game object is created and put in the array, it'll also be added to this list. And so now we have a list of all of the game objects that we could do things with later as we develop the game. I'll show you that this still compiles and runs, and we don't have any errors. If we click on the array parent, we can also see the list of game objects here. So that's all I have for this video. If this was helpful, please like, comment, and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next one. See you later.